So, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our latest webinar, Crisis Management, How to Work Effectively with the Police. We, as you know, as most of you know, help organisations to plan, train, rehearse, and sometimes handle the worst day of their corporate lives. And sometimes that worst day of their lives involves a major incident, whether that be a fire, perish the thought, a terrorist incident, or some other event which causes their organisation to need to work with the emergency services and in particular the police. Clearly that's something that most organisations are not doing on a day-to-day basis, and so we thought it would be really useful to get the insights of two people who have been on the inside, on the front line of the police, working with organisations to give you knowledge, hints, tips, advice to understand what that might mean for your organisation if you were caught up in such a situation. So firstly, some introductions. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jonathan Hemus, Managing Director of Insignia. We are a specialist crisis management consultancy working with organisations on crisis management planning, training, exercising and advice. And I'd now like to introduce the two most important members of this webinar, Amanda Coleman, who is Head of Corporate Communications at Greater Manchester Police, and Paul Breed, who is a former police superintendent. So we have representation from both the communications side of the police force and also from the operational side. So perhaps Amanda first, if you could just give us a couple of minutes in terms of your background and current role.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. I was going to say I've worked in police communications roles for 17 years now, and started as a journalist and moved into public relations. At the moment, Head of Corporate Communications at Greater Manchester Police, and I'm also the chair of the Association of Police Communicators, which is a national body that works with all police force communicators. So, as you can imagine, Greater Manchester is a busy area. We have quite a few incidents that happen, from kind of serious incidents right through to what we'd say was major incidents and critical events. So I've worked on quite a few things, including kind of terrorism-related issues, and the riots we had a few years ago, and a whole range of other bits and pieces. So I've got a little bit of background, I suppose, and a little bit of experience of dealing with both the internal kind of police structures that I know Paul obviously knows about in detail, and also working with other agencies, businesses and other companies.
Fantastic. Thank you, Amanda. And I'd now like to welcome Paul Breed. Paul very kindly is joining us from Canada. That's not because he was one of the first people to head over the border after this morning's election result, but because Paul moved there beforehand. But Paul, could you tell us a little bit about your police experience, please?
Thank you, Jonathan, and good afternoon, everybody, or good morning from Canada. Yes, certainly I retired from the police service last year after 26 years service. Most of my service was spent within specialist operations, dealing with major incidents, major events, major sporting events, and as you can imagine, a number of high-risk, low-frequency events. And those 26 years were spent both in operational, tactical and strategic levels, with Avon and Somerset Constabulary in Bristol and then North Wales Police for the last 5 years of service. So as I say, a number of examples of dealing with high-risk, low-frequency events, major incidents, one of which being like the arrest and operation of Isa Ibrahim, who's probably our first homegrown terrorist after the London bombings in 2007, where he tried to blow up a large shopping gallery in Bristol, and subsequently the lessons that were learned from that. Last year, I went out to Abu Dhabi as a strategic advisor on crisis management and business continuity. And this year, emigrated to Canada and now train business continuity and crisis management for Western Canada linked to the Business Continuity Institute.
Fantastic.
And that is me.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Paul. So we have 55 minutes. As always, we will keep our promise of making this webinar last no more than an hour, but there is a lot of ground to cover. So I've already pre-apologised to our panellists that I may interject and rush us through our agenda so that we can cover as much ground as possible. Notwithstanding that, if you in the audience have questions, please can you pose those via the chat room or question function, and we'll try and cover as many of those at the end of the session as possible. So what we really want to look at here is, what is the police approach to a major incident? And critically, I know for the people on this call, what might that mean for those organisations who are also at the heart of that situation in terms of what they need to think about and do, and what should they expect? So I guess if we think about a major incident, Paul, let's imagine that there has been a major event that affects a city centre in which one of our clients or organisations on this call has an office or a presence. Fundamentally, what are your key operational objectives when you're dealing with a major incident of that kind?
Thanks, Jonathan. Well, as you can imagine, with a major incident, the first thing that actually happens is that we'll probably get a flow of information coming into our control room, and that will be a good indication from experience that the volume of calls that are coming in gives an indication as to the severity and scale that we're actually dealing with. And initially, you clearly try and understand the information that's coming into you and turning that information into valid intelligence. And what I mean by intelligence is actually turning that information, trying to triangulate that information as to actually what you're dealing with. Because ultimately, you will have fact and you will have assumption. Mm-hmm. And from that, you try and decide on the key objectives initially that you're actually going to implement based on a threat and risk assessment. And for something like a major incident, the key objectives I would be looking at would be ultimately the saving of life, together with working with the other emergency blue light services. The police will coordinate the emergency services response. You may well be dealing with the local authorities and other organisations, i.e. the building or the premises you're actually dealing with. Thirdly, you'll be looking at to secure and protect and preserve the scene itself, control what's coming in and what's going out, so witness management, saving life, injured parties. Probably then going on to looking at the investigation of the incident by securing and preserving evidence, because ultimately, if there have been fatalities, the HM coroner and criminal offences may well have been committed. So we'll be looking at that investigative strategy, the distribution and collection of casualty information, because ultimately, with social media these days, people want to get to know quite quickly what's actually going on. We've been getting in touch with the HM coroner, and then ultimately we'll be looking at prevention of crime, any further offences, instigating things in the background such as family liaison officers to work with the families, and then ultimately taking that step back to understand what we've actually got and instigate, as I say, the assets and the resources in the background in relation to what we're actually going to be dealing with.
Great, thank you. And Amanda, if we think particularly about those very first early stages, how soon would the police communicators become involved, and how would you become even aware of a major incident of this kind?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're probably one of the first people that get contacted, because very quickly people become aware of it. But now, because of the social media and the developments, to be fair, often we'll get notification via looking through, about general monitoring of social media of an incident before we actually officially get told.
Yeah.
We always have somebody on call 24/7. So if it's in office hours, then we just get a call through here. But if it's out of hours, the on-call press officer would be the first person to be contacted. And then we'd mobilise really quickly. It's fairly standard for us to be able to mobilise quite a number of people at quite short notice should a major incident happen. Mirroring what kind of Paul was saying, obviously with the key focus being about preserving life and that overriding really else, that becomes the focus of what we need to get out. So very quickly having a holding statement, something where we can put the very urgent bit of information that we need to put out. And and avoiding potentially compromising any further investigation. So it is often not as much detail as people would want, but there's a good reason for that, as I say, because we need to be careful about the ongoing investigation and anything else that comes from that. But we can sustain, probably within our team, working 24 hours a day for up to 5 days if we need to.
Right.
That's the thing. There's the initial call, but we know when we're getting that initial call, potentially even a small major incident, if you have one of those, could last for 5 to 7 days in terms of round the clock working.
And so just in terms of priorities, because I think this is really important for organisations and businesses out there to understand, because they will have their priorities, you both have your priorities, and unsurprisingly you are both saying that Paul's operational response is the first thing is designed to protect and preserve life. But I think what I'm hearing you saying as well, Amanda, is that is what your initial communication is designed to do as well. That is the topmost driver of what you are both doing and saying. Is that accurate?
Yeah, absolutely, and that can and does and has caused difficulties.
Yeah.
Because obviously, if you're working with businesses and companies and they have a requirement to get the business back up and running quickly, or whatever their priority might be, quite just obviously from their position, a really important one. We would override it on the basis of needing to keep a place, an area clear, needing to avoid people going into an area, and those would be the message we would want to get out really, really quickly, as well as obviously setting the scene for the investigation team and starting to appeal for any information, witnesses, and things like that to come forward, which would happen relatively quickly as well. But yeah, it can cause conflict, I think, sometimes. But obviously, that's as Paul would say, I'll let him say, the nature of policing is that's
Yes.
where you start from, isn't it? The preservation of life and protecting people.
Okay, great. So, Paul, moving back to the operational response, how would you structure yourselves in terms of responding to a major incident?
Okay, we've got a tried and tested structure. And I don't want to go into too many police isms, but ultimately we call it gold, silver and bronze. Gold will look after the strategic element, silver looking after the tactical element, and bronze looking after the operational element. And to turn that into layperson's terms, in the sense that gold as a strategic element, they're the thinkers, they're taking over the helicopter approach, the holistic approach. Silver, as a tactical response, they're responsible for developing the plans in relation to the strategic thinking, the strategic objectives. And bronze, they're the operational people, and ultimately they're the doers on the ground that are trying to implement the silver's tactical plan. At times that's easier said than done, given the intensity of the incident they are actually dealing with, and trying to get resources all together. But ultimately, that's the structure that's been used for many years, both with the military and the police. And most of the emergency services now, as a joint services emergency response procedure, protocols mirror that structure as well. So you've got gold, silver and bronze. And ultimately, at the start of the incident, you may not have a gold in place. So the silver commander will take responsibility for both tactical and strategic elements, ultimately waiting to hand that on to somebody else. But there's people on duty 24/7 in relation to those responsive elements of the command structure.
And where would you expect those different levels of command to be based, Paul? If we've got an incident, as I say, in a town or city centre involving an office building or a shopping centre, typically where would gold, silver and bronze be located?
Bronze, understandably, from an operational role, will be on the ground. And when I talk about bronze,
like traffic control, that kind of thing?
It could be, because ultimately you'll probably have more than one bronze commander. So you might have a scene commander, traffic management, casualty bureau, family reception, etc. When it comes to the silver commander, there's two trains of thought. Some prefer to be at the scene or slightly detached from the scene, Others like to be back in the control room. Me personally, I always prefer to be back in the control room because you have access to all the assets, the CCTV, all the other resources they actually require there. And at times, trying to set that up near the scene is quite difficult.
Yep.
And then the gold commander, they'd have a gold command suite, and if it is a major incident that's going to develop, they then develop a strategic coordination centre, which most areas in the UK have strategically located. So they could bring all the partner agencies into that location.
And who would the organisation expect to be communicating and liaising with most frequently?
In the initial stages, it'll be the other blue light services.
Yeah.
And I say the joint protocol exists in that sense. But we'll be looking at local authority. Anybody could add value to what we're actually trying to achieve.
Yeah.
And that will include the organisation, understandably, that's been affected, because they've got some very good information in relation to the structure of the building, who's in the building, the intelligence in relation to potentially what's happened. So we have to engage with them. And equally, they are a victim of crime, ultimately, that we're trying to work with.
And Amanda, from a communications point of view, you've kind of touched already about kind of escalating a team, but how would you structure your communications response?
It's very, I mean, to be fair, it's very similar. We also have our plan to have a gold, silver and bronze kind of approach, because it does mean that then you have somebody as kind of gold, linking in terms of communication, so helping with strategic decisions, providing that kind of overview of social media, and any internal comms and anything else. So you keep a really good view of everything, and that would be either myself or one of the senior managers. Then beneath that, we'd have a silver who's would keep more handle on the in day-to-day in terms of what's coming in and the questions from the media and that kind of thing. But then you see we have a range of bronzes, very much like Paul said, that we would have somebody tasked on a team that would do the social media monitoring and engagement. We would have somebody looking at internal communication specifically because of the nature of what we need to get out to staff, but also then somebody looking at partner liaison. And that would be initially, as Paul said, the key bits are other emergency services and local authority in the affected area, but also then move into get whoever's the business trying to get hold of their PR, and then it would expand out to include other affected parties. People like transport feature highly, come from early on, obviously because of the nature of a lot of incidents and the effect on the area. So in terms of structure, it quite neatly, we kind of mirror it in our own world. And then what we do is have myself sat, somewhere near wherever gold is, so we can deal with that. And we would always have somebody in the control room. The way we've worked it often is a bit like Paul said, is we'll have a big suite where part will be the gold command bit, would be one end almost, and the silver and the other, and they would have every representation that we needed in there. So intelligence, investigation, and comms is part of that. So it works surprisingly smoothly, because you've got very quickly you can have the key people together. Slightly, as the incident kind of continues, you would have you get more people together, and we'll potentially then go to a position where we'd get representatives from the relevant affected organisations in terms of their comms leads together if we needed to, or we'd have specific meetings as things develop. But a lot of the very early stages activity is just firing emails and making sure people are informed and up to date with what we can and can't say, particularly because of the nature of the speed of social media, trying to get those messages out really, really quickly.
Great, thank you. And a number of our clients and other organisations have adopted the gold, silver, bronze approach based on good practice from the emergency services and also from the military, and I think find it a very effective way of managing their crisis response. Paul, I was just wondering, is there any benefit in terms of coordination if you're working with an organisation that has adopted the same approach, or not? Actually, in terms of the coordination with the police, does it make any difference?
Personally, I'd be in favour if an organisation's gone to the trouble of understanding the gold, silver, bronze structure, it does make life easier. And certainly I was working with an organisation last year who adopted the same approach. And it could be something as simple as if the fire alarms go off, they've now got tabards with silver liaison as soon as the fire service arrives, so that they can actually go to that one individual who's got the authority and the credibility and the knowledge to represent the organisation and understand what's actually going on. So in that sense, I believe it makes life a lot easier because they can understand where we're coming from and how our objectives are going to link in with theirs. And equally, we know virtually immediately who to liaise with them in relation to their command structure internally.
Great, thank you. And Paul, you mentioned a few minutes ago the coordination of the emergency service. Could you just kind of reiterate some of the key principles there, so that again people on the line understand, who has primacy out of the emergency services, and maybe thinking about the organisation, do they need to be communicating with all three, or how does that work?
Well, certainly since the London bombings, the lessons learned that came out from 7/7 suggested that we could work better together within the emergency services. And I probably mentioned earlier about the joint emergency services incident procedures now.
Yeah.
And most forces have now done the training in relation to working together with the blue light services. And that works quite well because we all understand the goals of the bronze structure. The fire service will have their identified goals of the bronze individuals, as with the ambulance service. So that works quite well. In relation to who takes primacy, initially the police will take responsibility in relation to coordinating the resources, and depending on what stage of the incident it's actually at, because if you can imagine, if it's a large traffic collision, a number of fatalities, well, perhaps whilst they're trying to rescue people, the fire service might take primacy, but ultimately the police as an organisation will coordinate that response and understand. And as Amanda suggested, if it's a major incident, from experience, most of the time the goal commander is normally the police commander in relation to bringing the strategic group together and chairing that meeting. So depending on the instance, there could be a degree of flexibility in relation to who's taking primacy at that moment of time, but normally it comes back to within the response stage to the police. When we move on to the recovery stage, it's then going on to the local authority, but ultimately still working with those organisations affected.
Great, thank you. Okay, I'm going to move on to working together, kind of what you expect, what you need, what is useful for you from the organisation. And perhaps, Amanda, if I can pose that to you first, either during an incident or even before an incident, what is it that you as a communicator want or need from the organisation involved in a situation like this?
Yeah, I think the initial, just talking about when the major incident isn't happening, I think one of the most critical things, and something that a lot of police forces, certainly we've been doing, and I know other forces have been doing, is trying to sit down with some of the key organisations, their comms people, to discuss how things would work. There's some national work taking place around terrorist incidents and how that would be managed in terms of information going out and what to expect. So it's been a useful chance to be able to sit down with key local authorities, certainly in Greater Manchester, Public Health, and transport, and in fact, all those sort of main public sector bodies, to go, right, this is how we would work it, and this is what would happen, which helps them then which they have done, identified some issues for them internally in terms of how they can then share information with staff, and it prompts a wider discussion. So I think that's, that early kind of conversation when things aren't happening is really important. We're trying to expand that out now so that we can have conversations with some of the key areas, key businesses that we know are likely in some way to be affected in the majority of cases if there was something happen. So that's really important, and it's something, I know we're all really busy, but it is something that is very valuable to do when you're not in the middle of something happening. And then in terms of when something happens, the key bit for us communication-wise is for them to try and stick within what we can say at whatever time, which can be quite problematic. What we we need to avoid is speculation, and what we need to avoid is rumour, and anything which starts to kind of potentially affect an investigation, particularly if we've got fatalities and everything else. So what we always ask is that they would share what information we can give them through their own channels, that they would try and encourage people to follow or link to or listen to what the police are saying as the actual the facts that we have at that point. And if they are wanting to put information out for whatever reason, that they make sure they've cleared it. It sounds wrong, really, but really that's what we need to do, particularly when you get things like terrorist cases, because they're very fast-moving. The situation can change quite quickly, and the wording of a statement can make a world of difference.
So, Amanda, at a really practical level, you're saying that in a major incident, you would ideally want to have sight of an organisation's press materials before they go out. Is that correct?
Absolutely, and we can turn things around really quickly. So, at the end of the day, we would have at that point an individual who would be liaising as that's their sole kind of role, really, was to be liaised with the relevant organisations, businesses, anybody who's affected. So yeah, it's easy to get stuff cleared quite quickly. We'd be trying to push information out to give people boundaries in which we know that they can talk about traffic issues or avoid this area, whatever it might be, or advice to their staff. But there'll be certain areas that obviously in a live investigation or kind of a live incident, you would want to avoid discussion around. Yeah. Because of it actually impacting on the officers' work, and Paul obviously can talk about that.
And just again, so people on this call understand, is that do you have the right to advise, strongly suggest what the organisation says, or do you have a legal right to stop someone issuing something that you believe is unhelpful?
I think what we try and do is work collaboratively as much as possible. We wouldn't want to do we don't want to say that for whatever reason. We will try and have that discussion in a sensible kind of way and explain the reasoning why, so that we wouldn't just say you can't say that. We would say we would rather you didn't say this because of whatever is the reason, and we'll absolutely always do that in the way that we do to the media as well when they call us and will put questions and issues to us. And if we are in the middle of an incident like that, and potentially you've got hostages or you've got somebody's, you've got lives that are in danger, you will be saying, please, X, Y, and Z would affect the investigation and the activity. At the end of the day, I think that's historically, for me anyway, that's worked most of the time. If we really felt that something was going to be put out by an organisation that would have a significant impact on the investigation, then we would escalate it in whatever way that would be required. But we'd absolutely have to, because that has to be, going back to where we started, that has to be the priority for us. And whilst I understand why people may want to say certain things, we would try and deal with it. That said, most of the time, collaborative working works well, and we can get through it. We can suggest wording and hopefully get to a compromise position.
And I'm going to ask you one more quick follow-up, and then, Paul, I'm going to get your take on what you expect and need from the organisation. But, Amanda, I just wanted to quickly also double-check the flip side of that. You talked about sharing the statements you're making. To what extent can the organisation expect that you would do that ahead of it going out, at the time it's going out? What's your kind of approach to that?
It varies a little bit dependent on the nature of the incident.
Yeah.
If we were in a position where we had a little bit of time, which is often not the case, we would try and particularly if it's a specific local authority or a specific area that's affected, we would try and have that ability for them to see it before we publish it. We can't always guarantee that. And one of the key bits that have come out from the communication work around how we deal with terrorism incidents is that we would be saying, and I've said to local agencies here, we will be putting in updates out via Twitter predominantly and social media.
Yeah.
And we will ask you to get your information from that. So whilst we would try to make sure we can personalise it and actually speak to people beforehand, it isn't always possible because of the nature of the incident that you're dealing with.
I understand. Thank you. So Paul, from an operational perspective, what do you expect, need, want from the organisation at the heart of a major incident like this?
Probably mirroring what Amanda's just mentioned in relation to the police and emergency services are still concentrating on priority to save life and prevent further death, etc. But in relation to the organisation itself, the police would appoint a bronze liaison, and as I mentioned at the start, we could have a number of bronze commanders who are dealing with operational incidents, so a bronze liaison for the organisation. But ultimately, from the organisation, if they've done crisis management training, i.e. in the sense of identified roles and responsibilities well before an event actually takes place, that will make their life easier, and ultimately the liaison with the police will be that much simpler. So they've got an awareness, and when I say about having crisis management plans, it's not just simply having a plan, it's a plan that's been tested and validated so that you're used to the terminology and working under pressure. Having a single point of contact, as I mentioned, if they mirror the gold, silver, bronze, that makes life a lot easier in the sense that they've identified somebody who's got the authority and knowledge to assist the emergency services and can make those decisions, those quick time decisions needed at the time. And that's where the gold, silver, bronze mirrors in relation to what the emergency service is doing.
So,
sorry.
No, I was going to say, so Paul, would you advise organisations to think ahead of time who their key contact point within the organisation might be, who might be that single point of contact? And clearly, as with all crisis team members, they would need to have deputies, because you can bet that person wouldn't be around on the appointed day. But is it a role that should be pre-identified?
I believe so, and that's easier said than done depending on the size of the organisation, understandably. But if they've got those identified and they understand on the day, whether it be on a rota system, who's responsible for what on each day, again, junior member of staff or junior members of staff know ultimately who to turn to when something actually does happen. So having that single point of contact who's got knowledge of the crisis plans, knowledge of the organisation, knowledge of the business continuity plans, and ultimately having the contact details and staff for future identification, that will assist greatly. So that having predetermined plans, tried and tested, is insurmountable and is invaluable in relation to what we're actually trying to achieve collectively.
What level of seniority would you be looking for from this person?
I'm a firm believer that it's probably down to role, not
Yeah.
responsibility, in the sense of ultimately some of your top management team may not be the best people to put in front of a camera, and Amanda, I'm sure, can talk wider than that, but somebody who is respected, who's got credibility and has the knowledge and has the authority to make those decisions. So not a junior member of staff possibly, but middle to senior level, if the organisation's comfortable with that individual.
And if it is a major incident, I'm just again thinking of organisations' resource planning. If it is a major incident, Paul, this single point of contact, the person that will be liaising with the emergency services, how much of their time would they expect to devote to purely doing that, liaising with the emergency services? Is it 5 minutes in every hour, or is it 60 minutes every hour that they would need to be doing that?
It's probably a difficult one to answer depending on the scale of the incident, but in the initial stages, if I appointed a bronze liaison for the organisation, I would imagine those two to be joined at the hip to a certain degree, especially in the first 4 or 5 hours, depending on the scale, obviously, and then that will detract or deteriorate as time goes on, so that we've got that good working relationship and we're working together.
Yeah. So particularly in the early stages of a situation, an organisation should be kind of planning on that person not being available to do many other things apart from act as that critical liaison point.
I would suggest, yeah.
Great. Okay, thank you. So moving on to planning ahead. Amanda, from your perspective, and I appreciate you've kind of touched on this already, but maybe from a communication perspective, are there any tips or suggestions you would give to in-house teams as to what they can do to be ready to communicate with you and work with you in the event of a major incident occurring?
Definitely, and it kind of mirrors something Paul was just saying, is that you really do need a crisis communication plan. It's easy said that, well, we can't write a plan because, you know, every incident's different, and every incident is different. But actually, if you do have a plan, then you'll have thought through everything from who are the spokespeople potentially going to be, depending on what it is and the nature of it, and are they trained, and have we prepared for that, right through to have we got laptops and IT that works that we can take with us, you know, and when we have a grab bag, which is basically, you know, as it says, a bag that has a load of things in it that should we need to leave and go somewhere and set up, we can do that. So I think if you've had chance to actually sit down and think those things through, potentially working with the key people in the organisation, who are going to be the people either in front of the camera at some point, or they're going to be the people that have got to do internal briefings to staff, the whole range of things, then one, you'll have thought that through, and two, obviously you'll have something which staff are aware of, which the comm staff particularly be aware of, which roles they need to have, what they need to do, what the principles are, where they'll be working. All that, I think, is very generic, and you can prepare for it. Yeah. And is worth doing. It's difficult because everybody's busy, and I know that often that sort of planning and preparation just gets lost in the midst of day-to-day work. But it's so valuable because it might only happen, you know, once in your time at that organisation. But being able to pick it up, run with it, deal with it, link in with the emergency services, and have a staff that know exactly what they're doing is just so important, because it you know, it means the difference between getting messages out and dealing with things early and getting caught on the back foot and having to try and catch up. So it, you know, it is for me really, really important. And also linking in, you know, I know most police forces and ones I deal with, if you ask them for the sight of their comms plan for a crisis, they will share it, and a lot of them are publicly available anyway on websites. So if you would need a starting point to help you produce something or start a discussion around it, I know that there'll obviously be people that will try and help, and because it helps me and my team in the long run. If there's many people in comms roles that I'm likely to have to deal with an incident, have an understanding of how we're going to work and how we approach it and what we do and how we can work together. So that for me is the kind of key elements, really.
Thank you, Amanda. So we've got about 20 minutes left. We already have a number of questions which I am going to from the audience, which I'm going to deal with at the end. So we'll spend another 10 minutes chatting, and then we'll come on to those questions. There are a couple of areas, Amanda and Paul, I'd like to cover before we throw it over to the audience's questions. And they're really, the first area is around management of the media itself, not the issuing of statements, but the physical management of the media. And the second thing, I just wanted to get the police's take on fatalities and the briefing of family members. So first of all, if we look at the media, we know the media have a job to do, and we know that if there's a major incident, of course, the media are going to be there in force. But I guess this is really an area where the organisation and the police will be looking for support from each other. So what can the organisation expect in terms of the physical management of the media who turn up at the scene of a major incident like this? And I don't know whether Amanda or Paul, which of you is best placed to lead on the response to that question?
I think it's probably Amanda.
Nicely. Yeah,
teamwork.
I mean, obviously, Paul can talk about how cordons are put in place, and I don't profess to know. There's certain requirements over how it works, and that's not my area of business at all. Obviously, there would be a cordon of some description, and the media would be kept behind that cordon. That is where we've had problems in the past, and we do have issues. Police officers get very focused, quite rightly, obviously, on the job they're doing. And protecting the scene, and if there's casualties, dealing with the casualties, so their minds are on that. And we do get conflict that can happen with the media, with photographers particularly, because they are obviously doing their job, but they can get in the way. In some cases, in the past, they will go too far, and they will try and have got through cordons. So, and this is where I think operationally, we try and get ahead of that to make sure whoever's on a cordon, that the officers understand that the media have a right to be there. We'll try and manage them in a particular location if we can, so that they get what they need visually, but they're not in the middle of creating difficulties for officers. But we can't stop them because they have a right to be there, and there's no legal requirement to keep them further away from the scene than the cordon. But it is quite difficult, and I say that has been an issue that's caused a lot of problem in the past.
And I think the other thing that organisations are often very concerned about is media approaching company personnel away from the scene of the incident, whether that's family members of someone who's been injured or worse in an incident, or maybe even the chief executive who's being doorstepped. To what extent, what advice would you give to organisations in terms of handling that, Amanda? And, what practical support can the police give if those kinds of situations arise?
Yeah, I mean, we get focused on the external communication around dealing with a critical incident or a major incident. The internal communications within organisations is as important. One of the most important things, I think, is to have systems and processes in place where you can share messages with staff, so that they are aware of what they can say if they are approached by the media, so that you don't get that position where they're just not saying anything. Albeit sometimes that's where we need to be. So best way obviously to do it like that. The other issue is we have and will intervene if an organisation's staff are being approached and it is unwanted and unwarranted. Then we will ask the media to leave them in peace, to leave them alone. We'll attempt to provide something on behalf of that organisation or those staff if we need to. We do this a lot with victims of crime, where they want to tell their story, but they don't necessarily want to have to do a massive press conference with the world's media. So there are things we can do that can facilitate that, and we would do that for an organisation if it needed that support. At the end of the day, we will or absolutely put complaints to IPSO or Ofcom or whichever body is responsible if that behaviour is unacceptable, and it has been done in the past, and we would absolutely do it again. So the key bit, make sure that the staff know what they can and can't say and what you want them to do if they're approached by the media, and make sure that the chief exec has something that they can say that's not going to make them look, that's not going to catch them out, because we don't want that. Much better for us if that person has got something they can say which isn't going to pose us an issue, and they can deal with that. But be quite clear with the media. If staff don't want to speak because if it's about colleagues that are affected, then if you can identify somebody that is happy to take that on, we'll help facilitate and take some of that pressure off. Because at the end of the day, we deal with victims a lot, and we would see the organisation staff in that sort of way that we would try and support as much as we could.
Thank you. Paul, I'm going to ask you the final question before moving on to questions from the audience, and it's a situation which I guess you've had to deal with on a number of occasions, but I know most of our clients clearly hope never to have to do so. Let's imagine that a colleague, an employee, has died as a result of a major incident. What is the protocol for naming that person and for informing their family?
Okay, always quite an emotional subject, as you can imagine, but in the initial stages we would put a family liaison officer into either a fatality or a serious injury in relation to liaising that family, so that any speculation that's coming out from the media, as Amanda suggested, we can try and deal with that at source, so that we can liaise with the family and give them an understanding of what's actually going to happen during the process in relation to dealing with the coroner's office, etc. But understandably, there's constant media appetite for figures for the number of fatalities, and in the early stages of an incident, we should confirm that there have been casualties without going into too much detail in relation to the numbers, because at that present moment in time, we may not know the exact numbers, and there's nothing worse than coming back and then telling the press we've gone from 50 down to 40 or something of that nature. In relation to fatalities itself, we work quite closely with the ambulance service, so they may well give the number of casualties treated and conveyed to hospital, so it's a joint emergency services protocol. And it's the responsibility of the police to release the number and details of any fatalities. Now, in relation to names, normally we wouldn't give those out at the outset in relation to one without speaking with the family and understanding their emotions attached to that. But we try to keep that quite bland in relation to something along the lines of a 30-year-old male has been resulting in fatality from this incident. So to keep it quite bland. Should be no speculation in relation to fatality figures, and we'll only confirm the dead after we've got a true and accurate picture of what's happened and the numbers. So the family liaison officer had quite an important role and quite a difficult role, but we could have a number of family liaison officers. So if there's been a number of fatalities, we would try and appoint a family liaison officer to each family, so that again they're having that one-to-one contact. They understand the process. They understand how the coroner is going to investigate this death. But equally, as you can imagine, if it was a terrorist incident, the crime scene officers or the search officers going into that scene, they may well be dealing with body parts in relation to how the event unfolds, and each one of those body parts ultimately will be classed as a body until we can confirm the full picture, if you get my drift. So it's quite a difficult task, but the family liaison officer, my experience of using them in the last sort of 20-odd years has been they've developed such an expertise and professionalism. It really takes a lot of pressure off everybody.
And a couple of quick follow-ups on that, Paul, before we do go to the questions from the audience. The first is, to what extent are you willing or welcoming of the organisation being part of that communication with the family? A number of our clients are either, literally family-owned, or at the very least have a family feel to them, but maybe many generations of a family have worked at the organisation. Are you supportive of someone from the organisation coming with you to meet the family? Would you want to avoid that? How would you approach that?
Personally, every situation is dealt with on its merits in that sense. But as you say, if it's a large family organisation, I would be liaising with the family liaison officer, he or she who's actually dealing with the family. But ultimately, I wouldn't be against using organisation members to go with them, because ultimately we have to think of the family as opposed to thinking this is our protocol, and perhaps we need to step outside and be flexible in relation to what we're actually trying to achieve, because it's to take the pain away from the family as best we possibly can in those circumstances. And if we can work together with organisation members or business members, ultimately there's a potential win-win there for everybody, and to be transparent and open with the family. So I wouldn't be against that at all.
Okay, and a final question on this, and I guess this is where your two worlds very much overlap again. Clearly we're seeing more and more these days people who have died as a result of an incident being named on Twitter, Facebook, tribute pages, way before that's been officially announced. What's your advice or experience of that? And I don't know, again, Amanda, is that a question more for you, or Paul, more a question for you? I guess that's where your two worlds really overlap, really. Amanda, do you have a view or experience of that?
Yes, and we obviously have a huge amount of issues, because we won't officially name anybody until operationally family members have been informed and we've got all that support mechanism in place. And if it turns out to be not a suspicious event in terms of the investigation or whatever, then the coroner takes a primacy over dealing with the inquest, etc. So for us, it becomes a matter for the coroner's office really to make sure that people are named or not named and that kind of thing. So
So in simple terms, I mean, are you maintaining that discipline even if the reality is the name is pretty widely out there, or does there come a point at which you say, look, this is so well known that it's pointless us trying to pretend that the person hasn't been named?
No, in the vast majority of cases, we would stick to that, and
Yeah.
that does create issues with the media. But we're absolutely insistent that we do that, and that's because, again, within communications world, the primary focus for us has to be on the victims' families. So we wouldn't do that until we had that agreed, until we had that position. And it does cause issues, and it has caused issues. But that's
You stick
something for
with
the
it.
media to have to decide whether they do or don't print or publish or report. That said, there are very rare occasions when we might find we need to, but it would be done with the agreement of the family. And we've had an occasion very recently, which is not a major incident, but where, because of the circumstances, it was going to be difficult to do the official identification until up to like a week later. So, but we were fairly confident, but not, we hadn't done the formal processes. So it can happen, but 99.9% of the time, it wouldn't happen until we had everything, official confirmations.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we have just over 5 minutes for questions from the audience, and Paul, this is one for you, and you may or may not be able to give a complete answer to this. It really is. We've got guests joining us from mainland Europe. And the question is, to what extent are the processes that you have described similar or indeed different in other Western European countries?
I suppose I can only speak from experience. I've worked in Poland and Hungary on counter-terrorism exercises and adjudicating across there. And certainly some of the emergency services have mirrored the gold, silver, bronze to understand if there was an international incident, if they needed support, etc. They're afraid with that command structure, and certainly the military has been working with European forces in relation to gold, silver and bronze. So I'd be surprised if it was that different, and there'd probably be more similarities than not, to be perfectly honest with you, Jonathan.
Okay, thanks, Paul.
Yeah. I was going to say, if it helps, I've done some work in Europe on studies around crisis communication and social media. And there are a lot of, it might be called slightly different things, but there are a lot of similarities in terms of the structure and processes.
Great, thank you. Got a question here. A recent situation, a real situation that this particular member of the audience was observing, and noted that the company at the heart of it didn't issue a statement on day one, nor did they have a Twitter presence. From your point of view, Amanda, does that make your life easier because you can, control all of the communication yourselves, or does that hinder you and it would be more helpful to have the organisation communicating as well? Or do you not care either way?
In simple terms, yes, it is easier because it's one less thing to worry about. However, I would have a concern because, again, we would be looking to potentially do a press conference or do some media alongside the company if we could do that and if it was required. So not have them say anything so early on just feeds into the media speculation. So yes, it was easier for me, but no, I don't think it helps in the whole scheme of things in the long term.
And could you just talk us through the kind of press conference situation? Would you automatically want the organisation at the heart of it, at that top table? Would you want to keep them away from your press conference? What are the normal protocols or decision-making processes, Amanda?
It would depend very much on the nature of the incident.
Yep.
Clearly, for some organisations, there might be some legal issues in terms of culpability or responsibility, or and issues that would affect them being involved in that. And obviously, the police continue to try and maintain independence around the investigation and everything else. So it's not always appropriate. However, on some occasions where we've seen it with hijacks in the past, or you've seen it with issues at airports, having people from the airport involved within the press conference helps, because you can provide a much more rounded picture, because you've got the operational police side being able to talk through what's happening, and also then the business side talking it through as well. So it's very much a discussion that you would have based on the circumstances.
Understood. Okay, we're going to sum up in the next 3 minutes, and again, Amanda, Paul, I'm going to put you on the spot here, I guess. What would be your one key piece of advice for organisations as they now, reflect on what you've said and think about, hopefully this never is us, but one day it could be? What would be the one thing you think they should think about, either in terms of something they can do ahead of time or something to keep in mind should the worst happen? So, with apologies for putting you on the spot with that, Paul, what would your key piece of advice be?
I suppose my advice would be prepared. It's not when it's going to happen. Most organisations now have a reality of it's not if it's going to happen, it's when it's going to happen. So if they could be prepared by having those roles and responsibilities identified, trained and tested, that makes life so much easier for themselves and for the emergency services. And there's plenty of police advice out there. You've got the CTSA, which are the counter-terrorist security advisors, the National Infrastructure website, that's very useful in relation to guidance in relation to physical security, personal security and business continuity. So there's plenty of guidance out there. It's just working your way through what fits your organisation. But if you can assess and anticipate and prepare for potential events, that makes life a lot easier and makes them that much more resilient.
Thank you. Amanda?
I'm going to be really boring, because actually that's exactly what I would say. It's about planning and preparation. And I suppose the key thing from a communications perspective as part of that is know who people are in terms of your local police force, because they're likely to be the people who'll be taking a lead in an incident situation. So do try and get to know who they are and do that planning and discussions, because it's much easier working with somebody that you've had a conversation with at some point.
Thank you. So in the last couple of minutes, first thing, of course, is to thank you, Paul. Thank you, Amanda, for giving of your time, expertise and insight. I think this has been a really rich session, and judging by the number of people on this webinar and the number of questions that have come in, clearly the organisations involved agree. So I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. Thank you both very, very much indeed. I'd just like to confirm for those listening, this webinar will be available as a recording. So if you have missed anything, then we will send you a link so that you can replay it or check out that key advice that you heard. And just a quick date for your diary. Our next webinar will be the 18th of January 2017, early next year, with Guy Esnuff, the Director of External Communications from RWE npower. Guy, I heard speak at a recent conference, and he has some incredibly rich learnings and insights from handling a whole range of situations through his career with pharmaceutical companies through to now major power companies, and he's got some really interesting insights into handling some of the most challenging, high profile and sometimes controversial issues, and I think you'll be very interested to hear what Guy has to say. So thank you very much for joining us on this call. If you have any comments or feedback, please do let us have them. If you have any questions you weren't able to put, then send them through and we'll see if we can get them answered for you. But thanks everyone for attending. We look forward to speaking with you again in the new year, and have a safe and crisis-free afternoon. Thank you very much.